Other than knowing that I've walked a whole lot today, why do I care? What differences does this actually make in my life? Does it really mean that I'm going to be healthier?
So again, we care about it because it's a very crude, indirect way to figure out how much people are moving. And so generally speaking, kind of no matter where you look, there's a strong association with an increase in amount of steps to a decrease in all-cause mortality, a decrease in cardiovascular disease mortality, and all of those really important outcomes that we care about. So
the punchline is, it is a decent metric to track the amount you are actually moving, and has a direct impact on health span and lifespan.
Definitely. You get your steps up, we can pretty confidently say it's going to help people die less.
Right.
That's essentially what's happening. So if we look specifically at a few studies, I think that'll help, drive home some of these points. Firstly, in the United States, adults are achieving roughly 5,100 to 6,500 steps per day.
Okay.
On average.
Is that good or bad?
That cut point ends up being lower than what would ultimately be recommended to kind of hit the minimum to gain those added, cardiovascular benefits. One paper, the association of step volume and intensity with all-cause mortality in older women, they found that more steps taken per day are associated with lower mortality rates until approximately 7,500 steps per day. And the common theme here is around that 7,500, 7,000, we'll see it sort of a leveling off of the benefit.
Okay.
And so that's why the 10,000 step controversy thing comes back. So it's not that you don't 100% need 10,000 steps to achieve these associative benefits,
right,
so to speak. So that's one example. There was another study from August of 2021. So walking 16,000 steps per day was associated with a 66% reduction in all-cause mortality when compared to walking just 2,700 steps per day. And so that 2,700 is well below the average.
Yeah.
But that was sort of the lower quartile that was used in the cohorts from that study. So, I mean, there's plenty of people 2,000, 3,000 steps a day or less.
Yeah.
So it's just a interesting observation. The other interesting point from that study, rates of all-cause mortality were about 12% lower per 1,000 steps per day. So as you bump that number up by 1,000 from this study, you get this incremental positive gain in reducing your
How long was the study?
So what they would do in a lot of these, they would take a certain age group, let's say 20 to 60, and they would only track their steps for a week.
Oh.
They would track their steps for a week and then follow up with them, for example, in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But they would extrapolate the idea that they were still
moving,
walking 6,000 steps per day, walking 16,000 steps per day. They were operating under the assumption that our behaviors stay relatively maintained.
I wonder.
So that is a massive point that can't be understated. I don't think it throws these out the window.
Sure.
Because to the flip side, there are interventional studies that have looked at, groups of people that they've assigned walking protocols to, and we've seen health benefits, reduced blood pressure, increased VO2 max, increased 6-minute walk distance, decrease in BMI. So there's so many factors here. I know we're zeroing in on longevity. We're zeroing in on these associative studies, these observational studies. But when you start to pull things from all the different areas, it still points toward the direction of more steps, more health benefit.
Yeah.
But that's a great question because it highlights the massive, in my opinion, the biggest limitation. So there was another study published March of 2022, daily steps and all-cause mortality. Compared with adults in the lowest steps per day quartile, adults in the highest steps per day quartile had a 40 to 53% lower risk of mortality.
Okay.
Which is substantial.
So in English, that means if you were in the top 25% of steps, you had a 40 to 50% lower risk of dying than those in the bottom 25%.
Exactly. And so that bottom quartile was again that 2,700-ish, 2,500, 2,000, depending on the paper. In that same study, there was progressively lower risk of mortality among adults aged 60 years and older until about 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day.
Okay.
And among adults younger than 60 until about 8,000 to 10,000.
Okay.
And so look, these are different papers,
Right.
and they're pointing in the same direction. The study that looked primarily at older women, the threshold seemed to be about 7,500.
Right.
6,000 to 8,000 steps per day, 8,000 to 10,000 steps per day. Now you can see, I think, where the sensible recommendation is.
Yeah.
Is it 6,500? That's great. 7,500, even better. 8,000, perfect.
Yeah.
10,000, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
But again, we see this sort of leveling off because again, and there's more to physical activity than walking.
I was just going to say,
this is one piece of the pie.
it seems like this is a base layer, and you can make that base layer as big and broad as you want. But at some point in time, if you want to gain more benefits, you're going to have to build on top of that through more vigorous activity.
Yeah.
Whether it's running or jogging or biking or swimming or rowing or lifting weights or something else, you need something on top of that to continue to build that health pyramid.
Yep. I don't want to lose sight of that theme. That's a huge, huge point. The last piece of that would be, it seems as though what's echoed in the media anyway, that, kind of corroborates what these studies were showing. It's possible to attain benefit, tempered benefit, below the 10,000 step threshold.
Yeah.
So there was one last study, which was just published March of 2023.
That is new.
This was a little nuanced. It's the only reason why I want to mention this one. It categorized participants into 3 groups according to the number of days per week that they took 8,000 steps or more.
Okay.
So they zeroed in on that cut point,
as
8,000
a minimum.
As a minimum.
Yep.
So they got that data from all the other ones that we just mentioned. All right, let's look at those who hit 8,000 steps on 0 days per week, 1 to 2 days per week, and 3 to 7 days per week.
Okay.
The all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality risk was lower as the days per week increased, but the protective association plateaued at 3 days per week. So again, we see this leveling off.
Makes sense.
It doesn't have to be 8,000 to 10,000, 20,000 steps a day, 7 days a week for the rest of your life, potentially. That's great because this is something that we can say more is better with exercise and moving around.
Yeah.
More is typically better. But again, 8,000 steps per day is a safe long-term goal. It doesn't have to be 7 days a week. 7 days a week is great, but we can see in this associative data that it sort of levels off. And I think we could have a whole separate discussion as to why that is.
Yeah.
But again, it just brings in the idea that you mentioned, improving your fitness, improving your health by way of physical activity.
Yeah.
It's this scaffolding process.
Yeah.
And so daily movement by way of tracking your steps indirectly can be a huge foundational layer. But then what's above that?
Right.
Maybe it's 1 day a week of resistance training. Then it's 2 days a week. Then it's 3 days a week. Who knows what happens to that plateau if you start resistance training 3 days a week? What if you start moving to minimally processed foods? You know what I mean? You start it's really fun and easy to look at these things in isolated conversations.
Right.
But who's to say, it's not that you just get this multiplied benefit. Then you become superhuman. We mentioned, or we alluded to, again, some of these exercise science principles now.
Yeah.
Right. There aren't a ton of studies. There are some that look at what's the necessary walking speed, what's the necessary walking intensity. Now, depending on what the study is, one of the main ones concluded that as long as you're hitting the recommended step target, 6,000, 8,000, 7,500, doesn't matter how intense the steps were.
Okay.
So that baseline level of daily movement in 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 steps, as long as you're getting them in, that's most important.
Okay.
What does that sound like? Okay, you're starting to change your diet. Yes, we can tell you all these different food groups and this sort of thing, and this tastes better than that, and this is more optimal, and this has more fiber. Well, if you just focus on maybe calories in, calories out,
Right.
learning how many calories was in that meal that you just ate, and that sort of thing, starting on a more basic level, it's very analogous to this.
Yeah.
Get the baseline number of steps in. Just forget about the intensity at first. And as you scaffold those behaviors, you get better at it, you improve, then you can start to, add
Worry
1,000.
about things.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Add some intensity, focus on your cadence. Those sorts of things come in later. If you can only tolerate 1 to 2 minutes of walking,
Right.
that's fine. That doesn't mean you
Start
just blow.
there.
That doesn't mean you just don't do it
Yeah.
because that's your entry point. But what that does mean is if 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day of walking is going to bump up your step count by like 2,000 steps a day is what the general recommendation is as far as like a stepwise approach.
Uh-huh.
If you start there, ideally you don't stay there. So you want to still keep in mind that there's going to be
Progressive overload.
Yes, there's going to still have to be progressive overload. That doesn't mean you force it, and just because you've walked for 2 weeks that you increase your step count
Right.
exorbitantly the next 2 weeks. You have to figure out what am I tolerating? Let those sort of adaptations occur, and then next thing you know, it's 4,000 becomes 6,000, 6,000 becomes 8,000. For me, it might take 6 months. For you, it might take 8 months. For you, it might take 24 months. It's very hard to nail that down, but you still have to keep in mind that there's still a progressive nature here. And yes, 1 minute bites, those exercise snacks, those are great. But again, you want to extend this out. Before researching this, I had some vague idea
Sure.
of how many steps a day I was getting, but I was in the mindset of ignore it. I go to the gym. I do enough resistance training. I've done some CrossFit. And so I'm void of needing to pay attention to this step count. Well, my step count was lower than I would have thought. Some days if I didn't go out for a 30-minute, 40-minute walk, it's, 6,000 steps, 6,500 steps consistently over weeks and months. I think that is reflective, not to everybody, but that sector of people who have a sedentary lifestyle outside of the gym.
Sure.
Like there's so much more to the physical activity picture than what you're doing in the gym. And that's not that your life just becomes one big exercise party.
Right.
But you got to be moving around outside of the gym. There's tons and tons of health benefit up for grabs.
Yeah.
And so I have a smartphone. I'm using my watch. I'm looking at this more from a 50,000 foot view, not like over analyzing every day and like chopping up my steps to get them in.
Right.
But just looking at this from a 50,000 foot view to say, hey, you know what? You have been hitting it hard in the gym. That's great. Keep doing it. But you're still at 6,000 steps a day. Do you think that it might be useful to shift gears and might be useful to, say, hey, what are you doing at 6 o'clock when you get home from work?
Yeah.
Could you add a project at the house that keeps you moving?
Yeah.
Could you go outside and play with the neighbors and your nieces and nephews and the neighbor kids and all that kind of stuff? Something to use your fitness, but also increase your activity outside of the gym. Sedentary behavior is its own independent risk factor.
Yep.
For different disease states, different outcomes.
Yeah.
And there's benefit to moving and continuing to move, even if it's not at LA Fitness.
Fair enough.
And so the last thing,
Yep.
is it 7,500 steps a day? Is it 6,000 steps a day?
What is the
Is it 8,000?
What is it, Dante? Give me the truth.
Drum roll.
8,000?
Oh.
Shoot for 8,000 steps a day.
Question mark?
Definitely. I think shoot for 8,000 steps a day as a longer term goal.
Yeah.
Once you're in a position, aim to increase your step count by 2,000 to 2,500 steps a day.
Wherever you're at.
Eventually shoot for that goal.